Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? At this time, am going to mute everyone and begin our program this morning. So we have a speaker this morning, David Harris, and we are delighted to have him here. However, before beginning his talk, I would just like to ask our Rabbi, Adir Glick, to say a few words for us. So Rabbi, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. So good to see you all. I just wanted to share a few words of welcome. And we've all been watching the news, and I think so many of us are gripped by the sadness of what happened in the case of George Floyd, and angered by this ongoing plague of innocent Black men being killed for no reason. And we have serious questions about police training. We have serious questions about police methods and how an officer with so many citations could be allowed to continue to work on the force, and many more important questions. And a part of us says, enough is enough. We want tzedek, we want justice. And now as we watch the news, the protests and riots are taken over by violent elements, and we all fear what is the next step. And as we think the root issues are much deeper, perhaps. So we had this lecture planned for you, and on race and fear and law in police confrontations with a leading national expert. And Peter, our VP of programming, will introduce Professor Harris in a moment, but I just wanted to begin by wishing Professor Harris a mazel tov on the recent rabbinical ordination of his daughter, Alicia, who is well known in our congregation, and who is a daughter of David and granddaughter of Reuben and Mary Harris, who are beloved members of our congregation. So thank you for being with us this morning, David. And now Pete, our VP of programming, will do a more formal introduction.
Thank you, Rabbi. David Harris is the Semenko Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh's Law School, where he teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence, and other courses. We also know him, as the Rabbi mentioned, as the son of two of our late beloved congregants, Reuben and Mary Harris. May their memories be a blessing. David devotes his research and writing to the study of police conduct, search and seizure law, and the intersection of race and criminal justice. He is the leading national authority on racial profiling. His 2002 book, Profiles in Injustice, and his many scholarly articles on the topic resulted in new laws and regulations in hundreds of American police departments. He is also the creator and host of the Criminal Injustice podcast, devoted since 2016 to interviews with justice system actors, advocates, journalists, and many others, and news analysis and commentary on the most difficult problems in the criminal system. In Pittsburgh and in other communities around the country, he's applied his work to creating better relationships between police and the communities they serve, particularly African-American communities, to bring about both respectful, just policing, and public safety. This work resulted in David receiving the Jefferson Award for Public Service in 2015. Today, David will speak to us about his latest book, A City Divided: Race, Fear, and the Law in Police Confrontations, published by Anthem Press, available on Amazon and everywhere else. It tells the story of one terrible incident of police-civilian violence in Pittsburgh, and the case's full journey through the legal system. But the book doesn't stop there. It tells us not just what happened, but why, and why these incidents of violence between police and civilians, particularly Black Americans, keep happening all over the country. And this week, that subject could not be more timely. Here is how we will run today's talk. When I'm finished, David will begin his presentation. Everyone attending should already have their microphones on mute, and they must stay that way. If you've been on a Zoom call before, you know that there's chaos, and we'd like to have one speaker at a time. As questions occur to you, please do write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I will keep track of those questions for David, and when he finishes talking, he will take all of your questions one at a time. We will record this presentation up to the point that we reach the Q&A for later use. So just remember, stay muted and questions go in the chat box. David, thank you so much. We are glad to have you here at West Suburban Temple Har Zion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen and get rolling here. I think in normal circumstances, I'd have to set some context, but this week it's just not necessary. So I'm going to go right into it and begin by telling you the story of a police civilian incident of violence here in Pittsburgh 10 years ago. There was one incident on that very cold January night in 2010, but there are two stories, and there were two trials and multiple investigations. And therefore, the thing to do is to start from the point of view of the people who were involved. And that's what I'm going to do. So this is the police story. It begins on that January night in 2010 in the neighborhood of Homewood, which is not far from where I'm sitting right now. It's then and now, it was a high crime area. It was 11 o'clock at night, and three plainclothes officers in an unmarked anti-crime car were cruising through the neighborhood. Their job was to find drugs and guns. Their names were David Sisak, Richard Ewing, Michael Saldute. This was the job they had been selected for. As they went down Tioga Street, they thought that they saw a male figure standing up against a building, so they said. And they drove a little ways down the street, turned their car around, came back, and as they came back to the spot, the male figure was coming out and was at the street. They stopped their unmarked car. They got out one at a time, announced that they were police officers, held up their badges, and asked the man what he was doing. He seemed to want to answer their questions at first, but right away, the officers suspected something else. They suspected he was armed. They saw that he had a bulge in the right pocket of his coat. That end of his coat was weighed down. He stood in a certain way. They became instantly certain that he had a gun. And before more than a few seconds of questions went by, the man tried to run. But it was very icy that night. And after only a few steps, the man fell down into the ice and the snow. The three officers, all in plain clothes, all ran after him, and the fight was on the ground. And it was a tough fight. This man put up a heck of a fight, and it took everything they could to wrestle with him. And the whole time they thought, this man is armed. And when he got a hand loose and it moved toward that right coat pocket, they figured, this is it. Somebody's going to be shot. One of these police officers is going to die right here. And one of them began beating the man in the head this time as hard as he could. And finally, the man went limp. The officers picked him up, put him in handcuffs, went right for that pocket, where they found a bottle of Mountain Dew soda, which they tossed away. They called a wagon to pick him up, put him under arrest, charged him with 2 major felonies and a host of other crimes, and sent him on first to the hospital and then to the county jail. This is the story of the young man. His name is Jordan Miles. Jordan was a student at the Creative and Performing Arts High School here in Pittsburgh, where he was on the honor roll. He lived on Tioga Street, and he had come out at 11 p.m. on January 12th of 2010 to walk around the block to his grandmother's house on Susquehanna. He did this every single night because his own house, his small house where he lived with his mother and brothers and sisters, was pretty crowded. And there was an open room at his grandmother's house. So that's where his bedroom was. So this was nothing unusual for him. He went out and he walked toward the street because the sidewalks were iced over. Nobody was out, but there was a car at the end of the block, a dark colored car, and he saw it begin to move and then quickly move right toward him and come right up on him, to the point where he actually had to jump back out of the street and landed on his back in the snow. 3 men were instantly out of that car, 3 big men. They're all in regular clothes. Nobody had a badge. Nobody said anything about police. They began to yell at him instantly. Where's your gun? Where's the money? Where's the drugs? Where's the gun? And before he knew it, the men were on him. Jordan tried to get up and go back toward his mother's house, which was only 4 or 5 houses away, but they were on him, and they beat him and hit him. And his face would go down in the snow and the ice, and he couldn't breathe. He couldn't breathe. And every time he tried to push himself up to get his face to where he could breathe, they hit him more. And finally, he had a crushing set of blows to his head. And he thought, this is my time to die. I thought I was going to get robbed, but obviously it's worse than that. And he just lay still. When a couple of minutes had gone by, the men yanked him up by his coat, and then he saw a police wagon. It was only then he realized that these men were police. He was arrested, taken to a hospital, and went to jail. That was the incident. Those are the stories. And this book exhaustively gets into all of the facts surrounding these 2 stories, because as you can tell, they're significantly different in some very crucial ways. They're also very much the same. The street, the fight, the trying to get away, all of that. All right. But I guess what I want to say is, if you read the book, you will absolutely be able to come to your own conclusions about what happened. I'm confident of that. It's all there. And as far as I'm concerned, the reader can do that. I am much more concerned, and the book is really directed not so much at what happened, it clearly explores all that, but why? Why did it happen? And why does this keep happening up to and including this week with George Floyd? Thank God Jordan Miles did not die. He lived. And because of that, his voice is very much present throughout the book to tell his own story, which is often not the case. George Floyd cannot tell his own story. There is video this time, which is usually not true. But Jordan is there, and he'll tell his story through the book. But we must go further than that. We have to ask why, because if we can figure out why, we stand a chance of figuring out how to prevent these things from happening and happening and happening again and again. And we can see there's almost no end to this. And yet the injustice of it, the pain of it, is so real and so raw that we need to come to grips with it. This is not a problem anybody can ignore, and it's not a problem for Black people only. It is a problem for each and every one of us who cares about justice, what the rabbi said, tzedek. Think of the phrase from Deuteronomy, justice, justice shalt thou pursue. Let us do that. So what happened after all of this? Well, Jordan was facing some very serious charges. He had felonies on him and some misdemeanors as well. He was taken to the hospital first, as I said, where, among other things, his wounds were treated in a very basic way, where he was drug tested, no substances, and then he was taken to jail. His mother and grandmother bailed him out the next day. And chances are we would not be talking about it. There would be no book. We would never have heard about Jordan at all, ever again, except that then 10 or 12 days later, these pictures hit the media. These are 2 of the pictures that hit the media. There were about 8 of them. And it was the national media too, but remember 2010, we didn't have things going viral all over the planet. So the impact was mostly local and regional, but what an impact it was. There was instant outrage from the mayor and the police chief, every public official down to the streets. Here are Jordan's classmates from the Creative and Performing Arts High School who had marched across town to the courthouse to demand justice. And the call was everywhere. How could this have happened? What happened here? How could it be that a 150-pound, 5'6" kid on the honor roll, a viola player at the Performing Arts High School, how does he end up at the bottom of a pile of 3 very large plainclothes police officers getting beaten 4 houses down from where his mother lives? How does that happen? Why did it happen? And the crowds grew and everybody came. This was not just the kids. It was unstoppable. And it went on and on and on into the next couple of months. When the first legal proceeding came in early March, this was called a preliminary hearing. It's a hearing at which there's no jury, it's just a judge. The judge hears just a sketch of the evidence, and it's a very low legal standard. The only thing that has to be proven is that there is probable cause for the case to go forward, for there to be a trial, for there to be charges. It's not guilty or not guilty at this point. It's a low legal standard. A judge heard all the evidence and threw the charges out against Jordan. Those felony charges, the misdemeanors, all thrown out. Why? He said he didn't believe the police, that this looked a lot more like a young Black kid walking through his neighborhood at night, the police assuming he was a drug dealer and jumping on him. So the charges against Jordan were thrown out. Well, if there was outrage about what had happened to Jordan, now there was outrage on the side of the police. They could not believe their case had been thrown out, and they weren't quiet about it. And the union was not quiet about it, and their allies in the city government and in the population of Pittsburgh were not quite quiet about it. Very soon after the preliminary hearing, the police decided to make a very public statement, and they did this at one of our key civic events, the St. Patrick's Parade, which is not as big as your one in Chicago. I've been to that one too, but it's a significant event, and the police showed up carrying a message in what they wore. They showed up in great numbers wearing this. Now, it's a little hard to see here, so here's a close-up of the back of the shirt. We support our 3 brothers, with the thin blue line right through there. And the front of the shirt, which I don't have a photo of, was the numbers 3599, which was the radio call sign of the car with those 3 officers in it that night. Now, put this against the backdrop of what the police had been saying this whole period of time since the unfortunate events and the publication of those photos and the outrage in the public. They've been telling people, let's not rush to judgment. Let's wait till the investigations are done. And there were 3 investigations going on. There was a federal investigation, a state DA's investigation, and an internal affairs investigation, all happening. And the public was being told, wait, don't rush to judgment. The officers had been suspended from duty, but wait, don't rush to judgment. But you can see the police department members seem to have reached their own judgment. And the cycle of outrage continued and was complete. And by the end of St. Patrick's Day, we had a city divided, and it stayed that way. It was very clear that people were not of one mind about this. So the investigations really began to pick up steam at that point. Like I said, a federal investigation being run through our United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Pennsylvania, a state law investigation being run by our county district attorney, and an internal affairs investigation. The federal investigation went on for months and months. because there was a new United States attorney. He was handed a completed investigation and did not like what had been recommended. They told him, the staff told him, don't bring a case. Do not charge the officers. You don't have enough evidence. The new United States attorney didn't like that answer, and he ordered the investigation redone, not once, but twice. But in the end, he came to the same conclusion. He could not prosecute. So on May 4th of 2011, so that's a year and 4 months after the incident, he announces publicly, I cannot go forward with a federal case against the police. I just can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, why? There is the seal of the Department of Justice, which prosecutes these things and includes the U.S. Attorney's Office. And the reason that they don't prosecute is this. I'm not going to expect anybody to absorb all this, but I'll just tell you that under federal law, the federal statute for prosecuting police officers requires proof not just of excessive force, but also that the excessive force was used willfully to deprive somebody of their constitutional rights. And the Supreme Court has interpreted that law in the Screws case, which you see cited here. Willful means a purpose to deprive a person of a specific constitutional right. This is the highest standard in American criminal law. There is no other that is higher or harder to prove. That's why the federal government so seldom brings criminal trials against police officers. So the U.S. Attorney and the Department of Justice, no prosecution. The next day, the very next day, May 5th of 2011, we got this. This is a press conference featuring, in the center there, our then Chief of Police, Nathan Harper. Standing to his left in the photo, you might recognize our then boy mayor, Luke Ravenstall. And this is the chief announcing that now, with no federal charges, he is reinstating all 3 officers to duty. They're going back on the job. And, by the way, no internal affairs discipline either. The Internal Affairs Unit, which is called in Pittsburgh the Office of Municipal Investigations, had come to the conclusion that they could not bring any charges against the officers. So, no federal charges against the officers, no discipline. It takes more than another year for the the county DA, who represents the state of Pennsylvania, to announce that with his investigation, no charges against the police officers. So 2.5 years after the incident in January of 2011, the case against Jordan is dropped. No federal case against the police officers, no state law case against the police officers, no internal discipline at all. The police officers are back on the job. If there is going to be any reckoning with what happened here on that night, any reckoning, any justice of any kind, it's going to have to come in another form. It'll have to come in a federal civil rights lawsuit brought by Jordan against the city of Pittsburgh, the police department, and the 3 officers. And that's where the action moved next. But let me take a step back here from the story for a minute, because as I said, we can figure out what happened and we can see the failures, I think, of the legal system pretty glaringly here. And there's more of that story to come. But what I'd like to take us now, and I think the core question here, is why this happened, why it keeps happening. That's what I want to focus on now. And I want to bring us to thinking about 2 of the most pernicious influences on these kinds of confrontations. It keeps happening because of race and fear. Race and fear are the twin poisons, the twin toxins that infect our society and all of our interactions with police, especially for our fellow citizens of color. Race and fear. Let me talk first about some of what we know about race and how it influences these interactions. We know a lot about race and how it lays into our culture and in our minds. We've known some about this for a long time. Some of the social science that goes back literally decades, established in the post-World War II era, something that remains unchallenged even now. The dominant stereotypes in the United States of Blacks, particularly Black men, are that Black men are dangerous, violent, and criminal. Those are the associations that Americans, and not just white Americans, Americans make with Black men. And that has been studied, peer-reviewed, and validated across many decades. But right now, we have about 20 years of more recent science, most of it coming from social psychology, which has really deepened and widened our knowledge of how race works in very significant ways. And I want to tell you about just a couple of pieces of this to give you a sense of what we know and how those things show us how dangerous these situations can get when they involve race. So just a couple of pieces. Let's talk about this one first. It's called Seeing Black, Race, Crime, and Visual Processing. This was written by Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford, MacArthur-winning scientist, Philip Atiba Goff, head of the Center for Policing Equity and a professor at John Jay, and some colleagues of theirs. This was an ingenious set of experiments conducted by this team to show how and what kind of influences Blackness has on the way we see and the way our brain processes and brings up related thoughts. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you about one or two little pieces of this study. They used a technique called priming, which is well known and accepted in social psychology experiments. They show a quick image to an experimental subject as they lead into the actual experiment. So they show a prime of a picture of a face. It's either a Black person or a white person, or sometimes they show no prime at all. All right. So in experiment number one, they show the prime of the Black face, the white face, or no face. And then they expose the subject to a series of images, 41 images overall. And I'll show you what they look like. They show these images are all kind of degraded visual fields, like the snow on an old TV screen when we used to have that kind of over-the-air television, that stuff, right? So in image number one, there's a degraded screen, and there's an image very, very faint in the background. In image number 41, the image of the thing in the background is quite clear. Let me show you. Okay, see, there's frame one all the way at one side of your screen. You can barely make out what's there. And then in frame 41, you see the gun. Okay, and they show successive frames, and each one's just a little bit clearer. When they primed the subject of the experiment with a Black face as opposed to a white face, the person who sees the Black face first picks out the gun from that degraded image much earlier in the sequence, measurably earlier. The subject of the experiment able to pick out weapons well before having the people who have seen the white face or no face at all. Okay, so what we learn from this is that seeing Black people actually attunes us to subjects of violence. Other pieces of this study showing a Black face to people will cause them to be able to bring thoughts of crime and violence to mind much more quickly, associated thoughts. And when we feed primes to people that suggest crime or violence and then show them a picture of a crowd of faces, eyes automatically go to the Black faces in the crowd. All of this, Eberhardt, Goff, and their team say, tell us that seeing Black is a visual tuning device. It actually tunes the human visual system and the brain processing system in some very distinct ways, all associated with crime, violence, and weapons. Here's another I want to show you. The Essence of Innocence, Consequences of Dehumanizing Black Children. This is a study done by Goff and a different team of researchers. The lowdown here, the bottom line, is that when people see young Black children, they perceive them as larger, muscular, older, and threatening, more so than they are as compared to seeing pictures of white children and being asked to estimate those things. Do you recognize this kid? You might know who that is. That's Tamir Rice in Cleveland. He was 12 years old when he was killed by a Cleveland police officer. Somebody saw Tamir playing in a park. He was holding a toy gun, called the police, called 911, said, there's somebody over in the park. He's got what looks like a gun. I think it's a toy. That part about I think it's a toy never made it to the police. A Cleveland police squad car rolled right up on Tamir, right up onto him. And within 2.5 seconds, he was shot dead. 2.5 seconds, right? And what happened afterwards, what you see in the police reports is very much exactly what the Goff study showed. The officer, whose name was Lehman, said that the person on the scene appeared to be 18 years old and 185 or so pounds. Tamir was 12. He was not 185 pounds. And this even continues to show up in later reports by prosecutors, even when they know exactly how old and how big he was. He was big for his age. He was wearing an XL jacket and size 36 pants. He could easily have passed for someone much older. It's amazing that even when they know what the real facts and data show, they resort to these very old tropes because that's the institutionalization of these kinds of stereotypes and implicit beliefs. All of this makes race an extremely dangerous factor in any encounter with the police. The person who that the police encounter, if they are a Black male, will be seen as older, more threatening, more dangerous, and police seeing the Black person will instantly be attuned to looking for weapons and even seeing them, perhaps, as in Jordan's case, when they're not even there. He denied he ever had a weapon, and no weapon was ever found. He also denied he had a Mountain Dew bottle. Right? That, he said, was made up. Now, fear. It may seem odd to talk about fear and to talk about it this way, because fear actually permeates both sides of any encounter between a civilian and a police officer, but even more so between a civilian who is Black and a police officer. Fear is a huge, huge factor in these circumstances. And I want to say a special word here about police and fear, because I'm saying this is on both sides, right? And that may seem unfair to some people to talk about police officers as being afraid. And I want to make clear what I'm saying here. Police officers are brave people. They have a type of physical courage. Most of us don't, right? It was former President Obama who said police officers are the people who run toward the danger when the rest of us run away. And that's true, right? But the presence of courage or bravery does not mean that there is an absence of fear. And what I saw as I researched and worked on this book over the course of 7 years was that we do a lot, it turns out, in police training and police culture, in all kinds of ways, to amp up the fear that police officers might naturally feel if their job is going to be dangerous. We amp it up even as we're giving them training designed to deal with situations. It gets amped up. Number one, and this permeates almost every aspect of police training I have ever seen. And I've done police training and I've come in to vet it and witness it and so forth in a number of different settings from NYPD all the way down. Police are trained and acculturated now to expect that every encounter with a civilian is potentially lethally dangerous. As one of the officers said, in this case, in one of the occasions on which he testified, I believe that everybody I encounter is armed and dangerous until proven otherwise. His testimony. Now, where does this come from? Because I can tell you the data does not back it up. And we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. The data simply does not show that the police job, while it does occasionally get dangerous, is getting more dangerous or anything remotely like that. In fact, it is less dangerous than it used to be. But there are dangers. Are they really that broad? Is it really everywhere? Well, I've had this image up on the screen now for a couple of minutes. So let me tell you what this is. This is a book, obviously, book cover. The book is called On Combat, The Psychology and Physiology of Deadly Conflict in War and Peace. This is written by this fellow, Dave Grossman. And Mr. Grossman does a lot of in-person police training and video police training for profit-making companies. There are lots of companies out there giving these private trainings, and tens of thousands of officers have taken his trainings and others. The point of his trainings and many others is to make police into warriors, right? The warrior mindset, the warrior police training session. You can look it up, right? And the idea is that this is a war, that there's a war going on in America and police are the frontline soldiers. Or as Lieutenant Dave Grossman likes to say, it's a question of sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. This is his favorite metaphor, right? Deadly predatory wolves are ever present. The presence of lethal violence is ubiquitous. Wolves are everywhere wanting to take off the peaceful sheep that most of us are. Police are the sheepdogs. They're the ones who keep the wolves at bay and go after the wolves. The centerpiece of the warrior idea is the willingness, he says, to use, quote, righteous violence anytime necessary to defeat the predator. It's that willingness and ability to use righteous violence. And this warrior culture has really seeped very deeply into policing as a whole, even amongst those who have not taken this specialized training. It's everywhere. It's everywhere, this idea of warriors and sheepdogs and so forth. It's called the warrior mindset, and it amps up fear. It's a way of dealing with fear by saying, I've got the tools to use righteous violence anytime, so I can deal with it. Second thing that comes along to amp up fear, videos, okay? There is a kind of theater of lethal violence against police in the form of something like 100 or 200 videos that are constantly used and circulated in police training. Many of them are available on the internet. You can see them for yourself. But these videos are typically taken, as this one is, from a dash cam recorder in a police car. And they show some of the worst things that police officers have ever encountered. People shooting at police and even killing them. This particular, I'm not going to show you one. We've all had enough, right? But this particular image you're seeing here is an image of an assault on Deputy Kyle Dinkheller, who I believe worked in Texas. And this is shown to every recruiting class in every police department that I've ever come across, along with a number of others. It's sort of top 10. And you can imagine the effect of this, the fear, the awfulness that this would inspire. And you can talk to the instructors and they will tell you, yes, I want them to know what they're facing out there when they get out there on the street. These videos over and over in different circumstances feature police officers being shot at, being killed, murdered, stabbed, you name it, you name it. And this is the introduction to the public. All right. Now, there are good reasons for showing videos like this. You could easily imagine showing this and saying, what mistakes did Deputy Dinkheller make? What did he do that could have maybe saved his life if he had done more of it? But that's not typically how they're used. And the profusion of them, the number of them, it makes it into this kind of theater of death. It's no wonder that people leave the police academies fearing for their lives, right? Now, you know there's been video in police cars for decades. You know now that there's video from body cameras. And you've got to be able to intuit that for every one like this, there's probably 500,000 videos of perfectly fine interactions, of things happening without any violence, without any argument, of police officers talking down an angry person. But those don't get shown, not even as examples of here's how to do it right. Instead, we get this. Okay? The third factor inspiring fear in police is the presence of guns. American police have to take this into account because, as we know, guns are just ubiquitous in this country. They're everywhere. Now, you may not have one, I may not have one, but trust me, I think you know, they're everywhere. And this is something that police in the United States simply must consider every time they stop a car or every time they have an interaction. And people in police in other countries simply do not. All right, so that's a little bit on the fear on the police side. But on the other side, on the civilian side, it is a question of how much fear, right? Now, people could always be afraid of police officers. They might always fear police authority. But I am talking particularly here about the fears of people of color, of our fellow citizens who are Black or brown, because their world is different. And I don't think I need to convince you of that this week, but let me show you a couple of things that might be a little something to think about. This is Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's a well-known writer. She's also a winner of the MacArthur Genius Award and very recently won a Pulitzer for her work on the 1619 Project for the New York Times Magazine. You can see what she wrote here, and I came across this essay that she wrote while I was researching my book, and I've never forgotten it. I included a piece of it in my book, and she basically is telling white readers, look, you may not be aware of this, but you and I grew up in an entirely different country when it comes to the experiences we have with police. Black people and white people do not experience police the same way in this country. They never have, and they still don't. They still don't. And that is just a fact. You know, when I was growing up, I remember my father telling me, now, if the police ever stop you, you make sure you have your license and your registration handy. No back talk. If I find out that there was any back talk between you and the police officer, you're going to have more to fear from me than the police officer and that ticket that you might get. For Black parents, this is not the reality. For Black parents, they know that this is a potentially deadly encounter every time. And so they inevitably, I've never met or interviewed a Black parent who has not had this kind of talk, and they refer to it as the talk with their children. Sometimes it's before they get a driver's license, and many times it's even earlier than that. You can watch this video. I won't show it to you. It's called Dear Child. It's about 4 minutes long. Just be prepared to have your heart broken. All right. They have to tell their children, not just here's the right behavior, but this is how you survive. This is how you survive, right? Because we want you to come home. It doesn't matter what happens out there. You can only lose any argument you get into, any battle you get into. So do whatever it takes to get away safely. All right. Before we go here, the net of race and fear, when put together, you can see simply amps up encounters like this incredibly, just incredibly. And it is, in a certain respect, the fact that we have had the incident this week involving the death of George Floyd calls everybody's attention to it. But this is happening all the time. Sometimes, thank God, people don't die. Jordan Miles did not die. Other people do not die in these encounters, but they're happening all the time to our friends and neighbors who are Black and brown. Don't doubt it. Don't doubt it. So let's return to the story for a few brief minutes before I give you a few things that I think we can do about this. As I said, no charges against Jordan, no charges against the officers, and no discipline against the officers. They're back on the job. Two of them are still in the Pittsburgh Police Department today. One of them's in an outlying department. They're all still in law enforcement. So if there's going to be any kind of a reckoning, any kind of justice, it would have to come in a civil lawsuit. And Jordan and his family had filed such a lawsuit in federal court. That is our federal courthouse here in Pittsburgh. The case came to trial. There were three claims, three civil claims, and this is for damages. This is not for anybody going to jail because it's civil court. Abuse of process, claiming that the officers abused their offices and their official capacities. False arrest and excessive force. Now, the law in all of this is slanted in favor of police officers, right? The law says that it has to be proven that the officers acted in a way that was not objectively reasonable, right? And that standard and all the Supreme Court cases around it favor police officers. Favor police officers. Now, you may think that's appropriate because we want to favor the police. You may think it's inappropriate, but it's reality. It favors police officers. The Supreme Court tells jurors, look through the eyes of an objectively reasonable police officer. No 20/20 hindsight. Remember at all times that police have to act in split-second situations in which there is great danger. And people who come into a courtroom with those fears of Black men, you could see how difficult a case would be to win if you're suing police in an incident of violence. So you had these three charges in the trial, Jordan Miles versus the three officers. I want to tell you about one thing that I noticed during these trials. When people testify, and all three of the officers testify, and Jordan testified, and other people testified, their lawyer asks them questions. This is called direct examination. And then they get cross-examined, just like you've seen on TV and in the movies, except at much greater length, right? Nothing resolves in 30 seconds. But we expect that, right? So Jordan testified. He told his story just like I've told it to you. The officers testified. They told their story. When Jordan is cross-examined, as expected, the lawyers for the police officers called him a liar. And they called him a liar because they said he was not really an honor student. They called him a liar, they said, because he had exaggerated the extent of his injuries, even though there was medical testimony there for everybody to see. But most of all, they called him a liar because of his claim that he did not know that these officers were police. Of course you knew. The officers got out of their car and said, "Pittsburgh police, stop." They showed their badges, didn't they? Well, Jordan denied it. He denied it in his first reports. He denied it at trial in his testimony. But the cross-examination went further. Well, look, you knew anyway. You had to have known they were police. Why? 3 white men You're telling us that you didn't know that 3 white men in Homewood were police? Of course they were police. They could only be police, went the cross-examination. What other times could white people be showing up in a black neighborhood with a lot of crime? They could only be police. This trope showed up time after time after time in the cross-examination and even in the closing arguments in this case. And just like that, race came in to the courtroom, took a seat out in the benches, and had influence over the trial. It was funny because at the time, the media did not report on this. Nobody seemed to notice it at trial, but when I went back and read the transcripts, there it was over and over again. So the case comes to a close on the charge of abuse of process, misusing their authority, verdict for the officers. On the charges of false arrest and excessive force, a hung jury. The jury could not agree. And so the judge dismissed the jury, thanked them, and the next year there was a new trial on those 2 claims, false arrest and excessive force, the very core of the case. Pretty much the same trial, pretty much the same witnesses, the same cross-examination of Jordan. Of course you knew those were white people. They could only be police officers. This time the jury came to a decision. On false arrest, verdict for Jordan, damages awarded. On excessive force, verdict for the police, no damages. And this busted everybody's head open. How could this be? If the arrest was false, how could the force not be excessive, especially given what happened to him? Nobody was satisfied with this. Nobody. The one person who seemed to salvage something out of it was Jordan himself, who just a couple of days after the verdict issued a statement through his family, and I'll paraphrase here. He basically said, all I ever wanted was for someone in authority to say, what happened to me was wrong. And I feel today just a little bit like I got some of that. And now I want to go on with my life. Now, that wasn't the end of the legal wrangling, but I'll spare you all the lawyer stuff. The case went on for another 6 or 7 months in motions and so forth. And finally, after 6.5 years, it was done. It was done. Jordan was awarded some damages and everybody went their separate ways. 6.5 years. Nobody here is really satisfied. And our city remained and still is divided by this case to this day. But let me return again to that question of why. And now, if we know why, if it's about race and fear, what can we do? All right. The book contains 10 concrete suggestions for going forward to try to prevent these situations and for, if we can't prevent them all, at least minimizing the number that they are and minimizing the damage. And I'm not going to take the time to go through all of them because I know some of you already have posed questions. But I'm just going to highlight 1 or 2 here that I think are particularly important, especially this week. All right. We need to move away from warrior policing. It's just poison. We have to get away from this. And by the way, some of these companies that offered the specialized warrior training, they've rebranded it. They haven't gotten rid of it, but it's not called this anymore. So you may not find it on the internet in quite the same way, though the content is the same. But we have to get away from this. We have to get away from it. We have to move towards what policing should be, which is police as guardians, guardians of public safety and good order, not warriors in some kind of war or insurgency. All right. If you go to, instead of On Combat, to this, the final report of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, this was done under President Obama in the wake of Ferguson, you will find that moving from warrior to guardian policing is recommendation number one, and for good reason, for very good reason. This is the kind of policing we need. Warrior policing is killing us, and for some people, it is literally killing us. Relationships are especially important. Now that will seem real soft. And how do you scale it up? I get all those questions, but as so many of you I know, relationships in life are everything. And it is just as true with policing, right? I'm showing you a couple of images here from Pittsburgh, from a program that was created after this incident and the trial. The police officer you see is Commander Jason Lando, who I'm proud to call a friend. He was the commander of the same zone where Homewood is, well after the incident. He created this program that you see in the other image. It is 10 or 15 of his own officers who volunteer for this and on a rotating basis. Once a week, once every 2 weeks, they take the same number of high school kids from a few of the high schools in the zone, and they spend the day with them. And they do getting to know you stuff. They do scenario-based police training in which they swap roles. They, of course, feed them, because that's what you do with kids, especially high school kids. And then they interview each other, and they do it on camera about their lives, their dreams, who they are, what's important to them, what they like to do, how they spend their time. You'd be surprised at how this builds bridges, or maybe you wouldn't. And I have seen people leaving, both police officers and the kids, having very different attitudes about each other. This is the kind of thing we need. Can you scale it up? Is it hard? Sure, it's hard. Can you scale it up? It's tough. It'll take money, it'll take support, but this is the kind of thing that actually works. I've often wondered what would happen if this program had been in place in 2010 and Jordan had gone through it, and those 3 police officers driving down his block might have seen that kid and said, oh, this is that kid from the performing arts school, the one who plays the violin or something. Yeah, he's okay. Just, let's just find out what the deal is with him, see if he needs anything. Why is he out? Things could have been different. Use of force law has got to change, and we're seeing it change on the state level. It changed in California last year. It can change in other states too. I expect this to be the trend. I'm going to skip over a couple of these and go here. Transparency and accountability. You might recognize this fellow in the picture. His name is Jamie Calvin. He is a well-known journalist and activist there in Chicago, and he has been the driving force, along with his group, behind creating real transparency and accountability in the Chicago Police Department. Not that the police department has wanted it, but they've had to learn to live with it. All police disciplinary records in Illinois are now public records, and that's really due to Jamie Calvin and his work, right? I have had a lot of questions from the press and elsewhere in the last few days. That officer in Minneapolis, with his knee on the man's neck, he had, 16, 18 complaints. Why didn't they do something? Rabbi Glick said that a few minutes ago. Why didn't they do something? Why was he still on the job? Well, exactly, right? And the reason that he is still on the job is because the public has no idea. There's no transparency. And police departments, and I won't even pick one out, this is a general rule, have been very poor at holding their own officers accountable for misconduct. They know, I can tell you, they know who their problem officers are, and all the other officers know it too, right? But nobody wants to do anything. That would breach the so-called blue wall of silence. They have to understand that their success, their reputations, and their ability to do their jobs depends upon getting rid of the officers who make it hard, not only on the public, but for all the good officers. Transparency and accountability. So I know I've been speaking a long time. I look forward to your questions. I just want to end with this. We start with the idea of tzedek, of justice. And that is what our lives have to include. You look at the front of the Supreme Court of the United States, carved right into the front of the building is the phrase equal justice under law. Everything I've said here about one case in Pittsburgh and about so many others across the country, these are all ways of talking about how we create justice. This is the job for every person in the United States. Mr. Floyd was not just the child of Black parents, the brother of Black people. He is everybody's child, everybody's brother. And until we see that, these things will keep happening. When we see it, we'll create real justice for all. And that's everybody's goal. Let me stop here. Thank the Temple once again for this wonderful opportunity to talk to you, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you to everyone who put questions in the chat box. I have been grouping them by category, and I will start them in a moment. I know the rabbi had also wanted to say a thank you. Rabbi, would you care to say that right now? Rabbi, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
There you go. Thank you. I just wanted to thank you, David, for your presentation, for the scope of what you brought us, and for ending with the message of hope. As a rabbi, I'm always looking for hope. Where is the hope in this situation? It feels so hopeless. And the idea of the change, that it is possible to change the dynamics and to change the situation, at least makes me feel a little bit better after this difficult weekend of hearing this news. So I want to thank you. I also wanted to thank Peter Norlander and Carol Flank for organizing this morning, as well as the Lieb family for sponsoring and for dedicating this morning. So thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you. So to questions, I've grouped them first into this idea of fixing the problem, and then understanding the problem, social psychology and the research you presented, and then judges and juries. So in this category of fixing the problem, are there any success stories that you can talk about in communities, police departments in dealing with this issue?
Yes, there are success stories. It wasn't that long ago when the Los Angeles Police Department was one of the worst and most violent in the country. We can all, I think, recall, or those of us of a certain age anyway, can recall the Rodney King case. One of the very first times that police violence was ever caught on camera. That was the LAPD. And terrible things happened as a result of that. But the things that were the evil currents, if I could say it that way, in the LAPD did not stop there. There were scandals. There was all kinds of other violent incidents for many years through the Los Angeles Police Department. And finally, in the mid-2000s, a new police commissioner came in, and he has a familiar name, William Bratton. He'd been the police commissioner in New York and had a big part in reducing crime there. And I wouldn't say single-handedly, but coming in, he brought people into the police department who'd been suing the police department for years and asked him, what are my problems? Help me fix them. All right. There's a great book on this that I'll find the title of and send it to you. And the change in the LAPD has been marked, very, very impressive. And it has outlasted Bratton, who's no longer been the chief there. He left. A following chief, Charlie Beck, came in. The change seems durable. So it's a good police department now. The other one I would point out would be in Camden, New Jersey. A terrible police department for many, many years. And they literally took it apart. They blew it up. And they instead installed a special group of county police as a new police department. Now, this just isn't possible to do when you've got something as big as the LAPD or the Chicago PD. But they started from scratch with the idea that they were going to police with the public and not police on the public and not abuse people. And it has changed things markedly. There are a number of other police departments where I can tell you that this aspect or that aspect has changed for the better. So, you know, I tend to be pessimistic by nature, but I will tell you there are places where things have gotten better. Not better enough and not quickly enough, but there are places where things have changed for the better. So there are models out there.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions here. First, do you know if Chicago is changing with respect to moving away, from that, or moving toward that guardian policing model, away from warrior policing? And then second, do you think national standards would be better than the local decision-making and local authorities in the United States?
Those are two great questions. I'll take Chicago first. There have been improvements in Chicago. I know that, if for no other reason than things got so bad, right? We all can think of the disaster of the Laquan McDonald case and the revelation of that video, and the fact that the video was basically covered up for more than a year. And everything that happened in the aftermath, and the Department of Justice comes in, and then you have a consent decree, which is actually not with the federal attorney general, but the state attorney general. There have been changes, and many of them are positive. You sort of have to be in the time will tell mode to see how many of those things will stick and how many will work. But even before that consent decree was in place, Eddie Johnson, who was the head of the police department, the superintendent for a few years, he instituted some changes in policy, which are very significant. I was comparing yesterday for a media organization in Chicago, CBS television. We did an on-air comparison of the Minneapolis police regulation on neck holds and choke holds and so forth with the Chicago Police Department's new policy on that. And Chicago looked pretty good, I got to tell you, and it's a new policy. Now, the question will be whether the culture changes. Does the new superintendent coming in have the guts and the backing to change the culture of that organization? Because, there's an old saying in policing, culture will eat policy for breakfast every day. So you can have lots of rules and new policies, but unless there is an insistence on a new culture and a new way of doing things, it will not change, and not change enough. That in turn will take accountability. They have to be serious about holding their officers accountable for bad behavior, getting rid of the ones who don't belong there, and disciplining them, disciplining those who create bad situations through misconduct. And they have just been terrible about doing that for so many years. And it taints the whole department and the whole institution for the officers who are good and try to do a good job. The second question was about national standards. This is so interesting to a justice geek like me, because one of the very distinctive things about American policing, when you compare it to policing in any other part of the world, is how local it is. It is hyper local. We have in our country, of course, a federal system. We have the national government, we have state governments. Local police departments are basically creatures of state governments and municipal governments. And as long as they obey the Constitution, the federal government really has nothing to say to your police department, right? The reason the feds come in and say to the Chicago Police Department, we're suing you, is because they're violating the Constitution. But other than that, federal government has no government power to go into Chicago or anywhere else and say, here are the best practices in policing. We want you to follow those. They can say that to the FBI, to the DEA, to the Secret Service, to the US Park Police. Why? Those are all federal police forces, the ATF, but not to the 18,000 local police departments in this country. I did say 18,000. You go over to the UK, they have 45 police departments in the entire country. Now they're a smaller country, but 45 versus 18,000, hyper local. Right? So we have a much harder job regulating police in this country because so much regulation is local, therefore power is decentralized, local actors are empowered. Now that can be good, but it is also very hard to impose national standards unless what you're talking about are constitutional level violations. So if they are searching and seizing in ways unconstitutional, stopping cars, you can prove the pattern, great. Other than that, the feds really can't do much.
Thank you. The next question I have is, you referred to a number of HR processes at police departments. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on what solutions there might be, whether it's recruitment and selection of better officers, contract and union issues. We've heard about those a bit, discipline and termination of bad officers, or what are the kind of reforms that you think need to be done in that area?
Yeah, these are all great questions. I really thank you for them. You do have to screen carefully when you're hiring, and you have to know why you're hiring. For the longest time, we hired because people had been police elsewhere, so wouldn't have to put them through training, or they had military experience, particularly as military police officers. Those were your two big legs in, or they knew someone, right? It turns out that doesn't produce the best police department, right? So I would recommend looking at some place like St. Paul, Minnesota, or that county's, I forget the name of the county, the sheriff's office there. They have been hiring for character. This is something I wrote about in one of my earlier books. They look at the characteristics that they want in people, things like honesty and integrity. They look for communication skills. They look for the kind of officer they want. They know they can give them training and experience. That's how hiring should be done. Once you get them out, the only thing that really accurately predicts how good a police officer will be, how well they'll follow rules, whether they'll be violent or not, is actually behavior itself, right? So you don't really know until you get them out there in the field working. So every day in the early going is kind of a trial run. What do you do with this? Well, I strongly recommend systems that a lot of police departments do have. Pittsburgh had one of the very first, something called an early warning system, or as they call it, an early intervention system. And what this is essentially a data tracking system on a variety of aspects of police behavior. All right, so how many civilian complaints do you have? Absolutely, but also things like vehicle crashes, other kinds of aspects of report writing, numbers of arrests, racial patterns, whether you've been sued in civil court, a whole bunch of aspects of police behavior, both inside and outside of the job. And what they do with this is they make it a tracking system that at some predetermined threshold will send a warning, a red flag essentially, to the person's supervisor, their sergeant or lieutenant. We don't know this, but the superintendent of Chicago Police Department doesn't run the department. The lieutenants and the sergeants do, right? And an early warning system would obligate the lieutenant or their sergeant to call the officer in and says, hey, I see, you're flagged, what's up? And maybe there's a perfectly good reason that they've stopped a whole bunch of cars with only women in them, but maybe not. Right? But this gives us the ability to hone in on possible problems before they become catastrophes. Hey, you've got 3 complaints for use of force. What's up? I think you need some retraining. So you don't necessarily fire people. There might be perfectly good reasons for what they're doing. There might not. You retrain them, you counsel them, and if you can't fix the problem, you get rid of them before the worst happens. So those are some of the things that I think we can do HR-wise. And that you just have to have accountability for misconduct. I know I keep coming back to that. If you don't have it, all the policy and training in the world doesn't mean a thing.
Thank you. I have a couple of lightning round questions. These are shorter questions that have kind
I'm ready.
of factual basis in them. First question is, can federal funds be withheld if compliance with standards are not met?
Sometimes they can. There are grant-making programs that the federal government uses to give out money. And if the standards in those programs are not met, the money can be yanked. They can even be required to pay it back. So that's an effective way of getting departments' attention, both spending money and putting standards in that they have to comply with.
Thank you. The next one is, in the case you referred to in Pittsburgh, what was the composition of the jury, the race of the jury?
The first jury, now remember, we're in federal court. So this, if it was Allegheny County, just our county for state cases, our juries are somewhat, not terribly, but somewhat diverse. Federal court in Pittsburgh is the Western District of Pennsylvania. It includes Allegheny County, Pittsburgh's county, and then 25 other pretty white counties. So in the first of the 2 trials, there was 1 black juror. In the second trial, no black jurors.
Okay, thank you. In terms of some more fixing the problem questions, one question here is, besides having phones at the ready, what are practical ways we can be an ally that research shows is most effective?
Phones at the ready with cameras is a good thing. It's not going to win you any friends among the police officers at the scene, but I think you already know that. One of the ways to do this is to insist that your voice be heard along with and supporting people of color when they come out to support, reform efforts, or when they come out to voice their frustration and anger over various incidents or just wanting change in government. And then I would say you got to vote. All right. I imagine many people here I'm talking to do vote, but vote and make sure you are focused on prosecutors' elections. You have a prosecutor there in Cook County named Kim Fox. I know she's taken some flack for a couple of sort of self-made errors over that Smollett thing. But more than that, this is the kind of person who can change things radically in a jurisdiction. So if you live in DuPage or Will or whatever, if you live in Cook, look for ways to exert your influence through your vote.
Thank you. Another question here. How do you reduce stress on police officers?
Oh, this is an important question. There's sort of been, along with all the other plagues we're dealing with, a kind of plague of police suicide at rates that are very, very significantly higher than usual. Chicago was one of the epicenters for this. So in the latest round of consent decrees, and I don't anticipate to be any more consent decrees now until there's a new federal administration. But in the newest consent decrees, there's a lot more attention to officer wellness, right? There's a lot of attitude in police ranks that you got to be tough. You can't have a problem. You can handle it on your own. Police, I think themselves are realizing that's just not true. You don't have to eat your gun in order, to cope with the situation. And so there has to be a lot more influence and resources put within police departments to addressing those stresses when they come up. But the other thing is, it would be great to have less stress on the job with better skills. And the most important skill police officers can work on are communication skills, far and away. The ability to communicate clearly, get people's cooperation by talking to them is far more important than getting them to be able to do something by forcing them to do it. It seems, a little crazy at this moment when we got, unrest in so many cities to talk about communicating, but it's the key to everything.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions now on understanding the problem. And one comment from the chat said, racism is not getting worse, it's getting filmed. It's a quote from Will Smith. Another comment or question here asks, you addressed the why, but are African Americans being targeted by police with more frequency, or are we just hearing about more incidences because of social media? And does the prevalence of social media help or hurt in this situation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'll wrap both of them together. There's no evidence that the problem of unarmed African Americans being shot by police is getting worse. In fact, the data tell us that it's there and it's a bad problem, but it isn't getting worse. It seems to be holding relatively steady. And we could have a whole discussion about the shame in the data collection that ultimately forced two media organizations to become the go-to sources on this. But both of those organizations show the same thing. It's basically not getting worse. But the influence of social media has been profound. Not always positive, I don't think, but profound. And it has changed one thing irretrievably, and that is, in the past, think pre-Ferguson, what you'd have in a case like Jordan's, and what you did have in a case like Jordan's, because that was pre-Ferguson, but what you'd have in a case like Mr. Floyd's is that the local authorities would take charge, they would investigate, there'd be talk about, we're going to look into this, it's going to happen, don't worry, and then things would go kind of slowly, and then they'd go more slowly, and sometime a year and some months later, there's an announcement, no charges. All right, they'd kind of slow walk the things until nobody was paying attention, and there was no sense that this was anything, it was never talked about as anything but a local case, local phenomenon, maybe a local bad apple. What social media has done is connect all these things and tell everybody, no, this is a problem in Minneapolis and Sacramento and Chicago and here and here and here and here. This is a national problem, and that's to the good, right? I don't like the fact that it's, that it tends to inflame people. But sometimes being inflamed and angry is appropriate, right? When I saw the video of the lady in Central Park threatening that man who asked her to leash her dog, and she said, I'm going to call the police. I'm going to tell them an African-American man is threatening my life. There's a reason that got 20 million views and that people were so angry. That woman was weaponizing racism. And she knew what could happen when the police might come. It's really only luck that man, the bird watcher, didn't end up dead, just as dead as Mr. Floyd. She knows that too, right? Now we can all see it. Now she has to account for it. So those are good things, even though I'm not a fan of how social media sometimes seems to make people's brains turn off and turn them into idiots.
A factual question now. What happened to Jordan? And other than the civil case, did he continue his education? How is his life doing? Question there.
Great question. There's an epilogue in the book that will lay all this out, but I'll tell you this one piece of it. Jordan had great difficulty. He had a scholarship lined up to Penn State. He was going to Penn State, and he was never able to make college work after this. The post-traumatic stress and the injury to his brain was just too much. He eventually went back to school. He was working as a manager at a CVS. He was doing okay. But what ultimately happened was a couple of years ago, he started his own business. And he has succeeded in that. He's succeeded enough to hire some family members. 10 years on, he is married. He's moved out of Pittsburgh. He has not allowed himself to be defined by this. He remains a very quiet, very shy, and humble person. And I'm pleased to tell you that his life seems good, and he doesn't see himself as defined by this. It was actually one of the reasons he left Pittsburgh. People kept, when he would go in to look for jobs, people would say, "Hey, aren't you?" And things would go wrong. So he's made it on his own, and good for him.
Thank you. A few questions came in about the social psychology of race and policing. A few of those questions had to do with police officers in particular who are African-American or Latino. And so one question here is, does priming work the same way for Black viewers? Is there any evidence of how these encounters go when police and members of the public are Black?
Priming can work the same way, yes. One of the most interesting things we know about now in social psychology involves what has come to be called implicit bias. You've probably heard that phrase. And implicit bias are unconscious biases usually in favor of white people and against Black people that influence our behavior even when we don't know it. This is all based on something called the IAT, the Implicit Association Test, that probably some of you have taken. You take it online anonymously. It's something that everybody should consider doing. And what it tells us is that well over 80% of all white people, but also almost 50% of all Black people have an implicit bias in favor of whites and against Blacks. So this is alive and well because we're all part of this same culture that unfortunately is infused with some degree of white supremacy and racism. It's just a fact. It's there. And so social psychology teaches us, and we see that some of these same things, the priming will work with Black subjects and experiments too, not to the same degree, but certainly it's there. The other thing to notice here is that when Black people are part of the police department, I think this is a fascinating topic, and I've done some looking into it myself. I'd recommend to you a book called Black and Blue Police, or the man's name is Matthew Horace, Horace. He's a sometimes commentator on CNN. It's a fabulous book about being a Black police officer. And I said before that police culture is very strong. And if a Black person wants to succeed as a police officer, they have to be police, first and foremost. There's the saying that I sometimes have quoted back at me is, there's no, in a police officer, there's no white race, there's no Black race, there's the blue race. And so you would find many of these same problems, even with Black officers, though there is research that shows that Black officers are better able to read social situations and confrontations involving other Black people than white officers. They just don't read the same level of suspicion and fear into them that white officers do. It's very, very compelling research.
Is there any way to prevent those biases? Are they learned, or how do people come to acquire them?
They are learned in all of us from our earliest days. You may remember as a young college student, like I was, in your first psych class, seeing the experiments of Dr. Kenneth Clark, the doll experiments, in which the child, about 6, 7 years old, is presented with 2 identical dolls, black and white, and is told, pick up the pretty doll, pick up the nice doll. Which one is the mean doll? So on and so forth. And it follows cultural stereotypes, even in these young kids. It is heartbreaking. It is just heartbreaking. And there's been an update of that study, which you can see in video, and it just tore my heart out the first time I saw it. Are these things learned? Yes, from our caregivers, our family, our teachers, and our culture. Our culture is what does it to us. All the media, entertainment, news, everything. I can give you examples, chapter and verse. Can these things be overcome? I don't think the evidence is there to say that you can de-bias people. I don't believe that. There are some people, a minority of people in social psychology, who are beginning to say things like that. I'm not convinced yet. What you can do is take measures for yourself personally, or for your agency, your organization, your business, that can help you overcome those things in the moment and be less susceptible to having your behavior controlled by them. Among the most effective things you can do is to have more social contact with people who are not like you, right? The more people have friends, relationships, or whatever with people who are not of their own in-group, the better able they are able to see others as individuals who are not like them. There's a whole host of other things you can do. I'm happy to come back to West Suburban and talk about implicit bias another time. It's a really deep subject. I do lecture on that too. And we can talk about that for a long time.
Thank you. Do any agencies that you're aware of interview in a standardized way for racial bias?
Many agencies do look for things like that, but there is no standardization. There's very little in the way of standardization in the field of looking for implicit bias, other than that test I mentioned, the implicit association test. I think some departments may give that, but it's an ineffective way of predicting behavior of individuals in individual moments, because what social psychology teaches us, one of the most important things, is that the situation calls biases into being, into action. So the fact that police officer Smith may have shown on the test a bias toward white people and against black people does not mean that in this particular situation of stopping this car, that Officer Smith is going to be biased against this black person or biased in favor of this white person. It doesn't predict individual behaviors, because social situations, the dynamics of that interaction are what control. But we know that overall, the bias is there in the population and does influence behavior. So it's a new field in the sense that it is impossible to test for how people will behave in any particular situation.
Thank you. I think I'll ask a few more questions here, and then I will stop. And I want to apologize if I didn't get to your question, and thank everyone who submitted questions through the chat. The next question asks about the impacts of body cameras and how prevalent they are now in police departments.
Yeah, if you could see the mess that's around me here, I shouldn't have betrayed that, I guess. What you'd see is the fact that I'm actually working on a paper now, a sort of 10-year anniversary of a paper I did just about 10 years ago about body cameras and police. It was the very first American treatment of the subject of body cameras. Many more police, and so this is the 10-year look back, many more police departments have these than don't now. Certainly all the big ones have them, but they have not turned out, in my opinion, to be the panacea that a lot of people thought they would be. They are good for recording evidence. They're good at ferreting out bogus civilian complaints, and that does happen. but they have not been as good for accountability, which is what we all hoped for. At least some of us did, holding officers accountable. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. One of which is the plague, overusing that word, I suppose, today, of just failed to turn the camera on. Oh, the camera malfunction. That is so common, and that just got to stop. It has to stop. Officers have to be held accountable for that through discipline. Another thing is that more states now have laws that put the recordings beyond civilian access. So even when we know there was a recording, civilians are not always able to see it, right? So body cameras are pretty common now, but they've been a decidedly mixed bag as far as improving things.
Well,
And I was a big booster of these things. I want you to know that. So it's on me too.
I understand a little better why you said you're pessimistic generally, or but I'd like if you could to end on an optimistic note. If there's anything that you would be able to share that we can do, that we should be thinking about and aware of, or your thoughts at this moment, greatly appreciated. Thank you again for your time today and this wonderful knowledge that you shared with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everybody who was on the call, and everybody at West Suburban, Temple Harzine. I love everybody there. It's meant a lot to my family. I would just leave you with this thought. It's a very dark, dark time, because we're seeing this, we have this feeling we're seeing it again, and the pain is incredibly deep and incredibly real. I was a guest on a talk show this morning on a radio station in Chicago, 103 FM. Everybody on the show, all the guests, the host, and all the people calling in were African-American. And the pain in people's voices was incredible. I should also say that the opinions on what is going on out on the street were decidedly mixed. Not everybody favors what is happening. But to give some degree of hope requires me to say, first and foremost, it's easy for me to look for the silver lining because I don't have a target on my back. I'm a middle-aged white man. I don't have to put up with this every day. I guess if I want to give hope, I think it starts with certain kinds of work for the rest of us as we look to our Black and brown neighbors. We have to work at understanding the significant differences in their experience, that their life is not the same, that they get followed around in stores, that they get questioned by police, that they hesitate to call the police because of what can happen to them. We have to understand that that experience is real, that it is not something made up as an excuse for people. And we have to ask ourselves, what would I do? How would I feel? And then I'll just come back to what I said about Mr. Floyd. We have to see him as our family member who lost his life and think of how we would feel if that were our family member, because he is. He is part of our American family, our human family. We have to regard him as a person we must take care of, and everybody like him. I know that's difficult now, but we have to do it. That is the basis of the ways we can move forward. I can give you a lot of good policy-based, culture-based ideas. They're all in the book, and I've shared a couple of them with you. But first, empathy and justice. Those are the things we have to have. You must believe in those. You must act on those. You must insist on those, and you must insist on them for everybody. Thank you very much, everybody, for this opportunity. I love you all. If you would like me to speak to one of your groups, you can see the information on the screen, and you can buy my book at Amazon. But whether you do that or not, it was a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for allowing this to me. I appreciate it. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us, and we will end the meeting now, stop the recording, and we've stopped recording, and we are just appreciative so much of your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge again, and have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Thank you. You too. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, everybody, the people who arranged this. I really appreciate it. And let's be together soon. Let's be together soon. And I hope the next time we're all together, I can bring Rabbi Harris to be with you too.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sweetheart. I appreciate your being with us.
It was wonderful.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Good to see you.
You too. Love you all.